Good morning, everyone. Just to introduce myself, Lizzy Carlyle. I'm Head of Climate and Environment at the National Trust. And I've been working for a long time, actually, around the National Trust's environmental policy. And then more lately, that's evolved into our climate and environment policy. So I work with a team nationally, sitting in our Land and Nature Directorate, but I work really closely with our regional climate and environment advisors who are out at our properties day to day, making sure that what we say in terms of strategy gets delivered out in our places. And equally, the flip side of that is that we're really learning from how our places are responding to climate change and how that experience needs to shape our strategy. So it's great to be here this morning. Thank you so much for having me. Suzanne asked me to just trot through our net zero strategy and talk a little bit about how we use our habitats to deliver our climate action. So I will do that. I've got quite a few slides to get through, so I'm going to go quite fast. But please, if there's anything that you want to pick up, either ask a question at the end, or I'm sure we can pick up and chat more offline afterwards if there's anything of particular interest that you want to know about. So move on, if I can get the slides to move on. The National Trust has been experiencing climate change for a very long time. And I think it was the early 2000s when we first documented how we were experiencing climate change in a document called Forecast Changeable. I'm sure all of you are now experiencing climate change impacts in one way or another on the historic environment. Here's just a few examples of what we've been experiencing over the last year or two. Impacts internally at our places. So this is the marble chimney breast at Cragside, where water is getting into the fabric of the house and overwhelming our rainwater goods and damaging that marble fireplace. We're seeing impacts in our gardens. So here at Lime Park, we're regularly now experiencing sort of surface water flooding, which is flooding out our pathways and damaging the garden itself. This summer, of course, we've had the extreme weather, high heat and drought, which has really affected our gardens and parklands. I think in ways that we still are yet to truly understand. So I think some of these impacts of drought will be felt for a very long time. It might take decades actually until the full impacts are known. And then lastly, our sort of poster boy for climate change is the lighthouse at Orford Ness. This is no longer there. We had to dismantle the lighthouse because of coastal change. So just a quick snapshot of the sorts of things that we're experiencing in terms of physical impact of climate change. But we're also experiencing a really strong mandate coming from our stakeholders. So we continue to undertake insight work, both of our supporters, our members, and our staff and volunteers. And it's really clear that whilst concern amongst the general population around climate and environment remains high, amongst our stakeholders, it's even higher. So we know we've got this really strong mandate and expectation from our stakeholders to act. And that's meant that we've formulated our organisational strategy. This is our strategy on a page to really reflect that importance of climate change. So it's one of two overriding objectives we have for the organisation. The other one is around everyone welcome, sort of diversity and inclusion objective. And this has been really powerful, actually, having climate action described in this way, because it means that we're asking every part of the organisation to think about and describe what role they're going to be playing for climate action. So it isn't just any longer something that we own in the kind of small environmental department. It is absolutely embedded in our strategy and in our business planning processes. It's brilliant. I can't emphasize enough how useful this has been to get it described in this way. Having worked on this for a very long time and made some progress, this has unlocked so much. And so for the organisation, we describe our programme as our climate race, which has 4 elements. And these are the things that we're expecting all parts of the organisation to deliver. So race, it's reduce, adapt, capture and engage. And the first one is very much about reduction in line with 1.5 degree warming pathway, but also that we can deliver our overall carbon objective, which is to be net zero by 2030. But of course, as I've already described, you know, we're feeling the impacts of climate change today, and we've done quite a lot of work, and with some of you, I think, around understanding what future impacts look like over the coming decades. So we are really trying to get our arms around what does a resilient national trust look like and what are the steps and the pathways that we need to take to get there. Our trustees have been very challenging actually in asking us how are we making sure that the decisions that we make are climate informed. So that's a really good test that we've got in the back of our mind. Our third thing is capture. So I'm sure many of you know, but the National Trust is a very large landowner in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We've got around 250,000 hectares of land. That's a kind of blessing and a curse actually, because at the moment our land is a large source of emissions, and I'll show you a bit more detail around that. But there's huge opportunity to turn that round and really deliver kind of carbon removal from the atmosphere through our land use choices. And then lastly, and perhaps the most importantly for us as a membership organisation, is engaging others on climate change. And we are experiencing stuff at our places, so we do want to make sure that when we engage our members and supporters, the wider public or policymakers, it's very much with that kind of place-based experience at the front of what we do. So that's what we're trying to achieve, carbon race. Just moving on to net zero specifically then, we've done a lot of work around our carbon account and trying to use the account to identify the scale of our different emission categories and how to focus and prioritise, I suppose, in order to hit that net zero target. So this is just a picture of what our baseline, our 2019-20 baseline looks like. And on the right, on the left, you can see our biggest category of emissions sitting out in scope 3 is our farms, our tenanted farmland. But we also have a lot of emissions associated with purchased goods and services. That's pretty common with most organisations, with our investments, and with our tenanted built, our cottages and villages that we own. And then on the very right hand side, in the orange and the red, are our scope 1 and 2 emissions, those emissions that we're directly responsible for. So they're small in quantity, but they're large in terms of priority. And so those are made up, as I'm sure a lot of you have in your carbon accounts, around the electricity we use and the heating fuels that we use. Probably not many of you have got a number of grazing animals sitting in your scope 1 and 2, but we do, lucky us. So that's the scale of the challenge. That's what we've got to try and bring down. And actually, the other thing I would say on this slide is some of those numbers look very exact, because 345,817 sounds like that's a really exact number. It isn't. And there are areas in our account where we've got pretty low confidence. Actually, it's based on estimates. It's based on kind of survey data or model data. So it isn't, it's far from exact, but I think it's good enough for us to be able to proceed and make decisions on how we're going to prioritise our effort and our spend on decarbonising. And in most cases, it's good enough to be able to track progress against that net zero goal and our decarbonisation target. The farm area, actually, we've got really low confidence in our data. So one of our first steps is to try and improve that data. Right, I'm going to keep moving on. So if that was the challenge, this is where we're trying to get to, which is carbon net zero by 2030. And that means we've got to reduce those emissions through our scope 1, 2, and 3. That's all the stuff above the line. And that red dotted line you see above, that's our science-based pathway, in effect. So we know overall we need to kind of keep our emissions reductions up to at least 5% year on year in order to be in line with that pathway. So that's really important that we keep the pressure on reducing emissions. Because as I mentioned earlier, we do have a large landholding, and you know, we could just reach in and say, well, reducing emissions is really hard. It's easier for us just to plant a load of trees on our land and net zero that way. So that's why we're using the rigor of a science-based target pathway to make sure we're playing our part in terms of reductions. But we're underway with our work below the line to use our land to capture and store carbon or to sequester carbon. So that breaks down into a series of organisational KPIs that we've set ourselves. Now, I don't want to spend much detail on this, but you can see that we've already got targets in place around scope 1 and 2, around our travel, business travel, and around our investments, where actually we've got a very ambitious target to be totally net zero with our investment portfolio by 2030. And then various targets related to our land, including our ambition to plant 20 million trees. And then the ones in yellow are the ones where we're still developing both our data and our metrics. So we know procured goods and services and that built-led estate have got to deliver significant decarbonisation actions to achieve net zero. We're just still framing what those look like. You know, we're not going to sit and endlessly count carbon and set targets. We know that time is incredibly tight, so we are underway with delivery. Have been for many years actually. So just to bring this to life a bit, there's some examples on the slide of the type of thing that we're doing across the organisation. So starting in the top left-hand side and working around clockwise, we've got the Vine, where we've put in a water source heat pump. So that lake in front of the Vine near Basingstoke is now providing the heat into the heat pump that is heating the mansion there. And that's meant over the last year, we've taken out about 30 tonnes of carbon from the previous oil heating at the Vine. Next one is a picture of our cafes, and that's just to remind me to say we've been doing quite a lot of work on our food and beverage. So we use a common cookbook across all our cafes, and we've carbon footprinted all the menus within our cookbook so that we can understand where our highest carbon emissions lie, and then start to think about how we change our menus to bring down those emissions. So at the moment, that's not something that we're sharing publicly, but we're using it behind the scenes to develop our cafe offers. But I think we are keen to engage with our tea room goers with that in time. So I think that'll come. We're looking at how we use vehicles and machinery across our estate. So we've been trialling over the last couple of years, actually, a range of bikes, e-bikes, cargo bikes, which have proved really popular with our staff and volunteers, particularly our ranger teams. Actually, it's been really great to see how the rangers have loved using the e-bikes and the e-cargo bikes. And one bit of feedback is, you know, when they're in their Land Rover or the van, they're just driving through the estate and they can't stop and chat. But when you're on a bike, you're just stopping and chatting and engaging with our visitors all the time, which is really positive. So down to the bottom row, the wind farms is an image representing the work we've been doing with our investment portfolio. So an organisation like the Trezor has a fairly large endowment fund, which we started to disinvest from fossil fuels quite a few years ago. But as I mentioned earlier, we've now set a really ambitious target around those investments. And through our portfolio managers and our fund managers, we're really seeing some rapid results in terms of decarbonisation. We know we won't get it to zero because we want to carry on investing in sustainable renewable solutions, and those do come with a carbon footprint themselves, even though we want to see that decreasing. So we're also looking at how investing in forestry funds could us reach that net zero. We've been doing a lot of work with our domestic buildings. This is a holiday cottage, actually, but equally so with our tenanted buildings to try and get them off oil. A lot of these places are off gas grid, so they're on oil, which is only high carbon emitting, but it's also highly risky in terms of pollution. And we've over the years, we've had some significant oil spills, which have been extremely costly to put right. So we've had off oil, get off oil as a mandate for a long time, but we're now really doubling down on the energy efficiency measures in those places. So really driving hard at making those places as efficient as possible. And then lastly, at the bottom left there, this is just to illustrate how we've been adapting our seasonal programming to really think about the impacts that those programs have, and trying to encourage our programming teams to not only think about climate change impacts, so because they're working years in advance, you know, what does warmer, wetter winters mean in terms of seasonal programming, or indeed hotter, drier summers, but also thinking really carefully about the materials that they're using, the fuel that they're using for Christmas lights, for example. So I hope that gives a picture of how we're working across the whole organisation to achieve net zero. One thing we do have to really watch out is that we don't start to build carbon back into our account. So we have a growth agenda in the trust, and we are continually renewing and refreshing our facilities, as well as undertaking our conservation projects. So we want to make sure we're doing that in a really sustainable way. Over the course of the last couple of years, actually, we've developed a sustainable design tool, which is now a mandatory part of our project management framework. So all our projects have to complete this sustainable design tool. It's a sort of mishmash of all the best practice that we could find outside of the trust, and we've just brought it into an inter tool. But it's proving really helpful, actually, to prompt early thinking about sustainability in our projects, and it's definitely having an impact on the decisions people are making and on our governance routes, because it has quite a simple summary for our governance boards to get their arms around. Right, now I'm going to move on to land use, which is a bit that Suzanne thought you might all be interested to hear about. And I've got a few slides on this, but I'll go super fast so that we can get to some questions. So as I mentioned, our net zero target by 2030 incorporates the emissions reductions, but also we know we need to increase the rate at which our land is capturing and storing carbon from the atmosphere, or carbon sequestration. So this is our current position today, where we've still got about 650,000 tonnes of carbon sitting in our account. You can see our total land flux. You can see that our woodlands are doing a really good job for us currently. And I mentioned that we've got a 20 million tree planting ambition, so we're really trying to ramp up on woodlands. But below woodlands, you can see that our peatland is currently emitting carbon. So although we've been working for many years on peatland restoration, the size and scale of and level of degradation of peatlands in this country has meant that this is currently the position that we're estimating we're at. So quite high emissions from our peatlands. So what we need to do to meet net zero is we need to ramp up the amount of carbon sequestration from our habitats, and we need to bring down that peatland emission number. And so we have this sort of hierarchy of emissions and sequestration, where we want to start bringing down those emissions. So the vast majority of our emissions from agriculture and land use, other than peatland, rests with our farming operations, and in particular our livestock. And that's due to the way that ruminant animals ferment fibre and burp out a lot of methane. But we also, in our tenanted estate, have artificial fertilizer application. We have quite high levels of diesel use in tractors and machinery, and some of our soils aren't in a terribly good state. So we need to try and bring down all those emissions associated with that. And then alongside that, we need to deliver our woodland ambition, other carbon-rich habitats, and restore that soil organic carbon. And I just thought this is a very busy slide, so don't worry too much about the detail, but it's a particular farm, and I just thought it was a nice illustration of the sort of opportunity that we have. So Cinderbarrow Farm is a farm up in the northwest, in Cumbria, is just coming up for relet. So the current tenant is leaving, and we'll be reletting the farm to a new tenant. But in undertaking that farm relet, it's a brilliant time to really understand the opportunity at farm level for carbon sequestration. So this is just a model, and using an internal tool that we've developed, which shows the contribution that different changes make, from arable to grassland, from arable to wood pasture, from grassland to woodland, grassland to hedgerow, etc. So each farm will have a mosaic of land use type existing, and will offer a mosaic of future land use type, which is the kind of opportunity. And I suppose there's two things to note about this. I mean, first of all, yes, sequestration is really important, and we need that sequestration if we're going to hit our net zero target, and the country needs it if it's going to hit its net zero target. But I think sometimes that opportunity can get overstated. So I think we are using the latest information, again, that sits externally to us from Natural England, from the Woodland Carbon Code, from Peatland Carbon Code, various different models that exist outside of the trust that we've brought into this tool to understand what the size of the opportunity is. And I think, with woodlands, for example, creating new woodlands definitely has a really big carbon advantage. So obviously when the woodland is planted, there's very little sequestration happening because those little saplings aren't doing very much. But after about 5 years, the saplings really start to grow away and start accumulating biomass. So the trunks start getting bigger and the crowns start growing. And that's when we see really quite rapid sequestration. But then eventually the trees mature. So commonly it's around, well, anything really between 50 and 100 years when that woodland starts to mature. And then it'll hit equilibrium where any carbon that it's sequestering in its biomass is being matched by carbon that's being lost as that biomass breaks down. So woodland is great because there's a long way, there's a long period of flux between starting out and when it hits the equilibrium. Some of our other habitats, when we create or restore other habitats, equilibrium can be hit pretty early on. So if you're restoring an improved grassland, very little interest in terms of biodiversity, very little carbon or sequestration going on, and there may be nothing, it may even be emitting. Restoring that to a carbon-rich grassland will be really great in terms of species diversity. It'll be great in terms of landscape factors, and it will play a part in terms of carbon. But we know with grassland, it could hit that point of equilibrium pretty fast. It may be within 5 to 20 years where it stops sequestering carbon. So I think it's just something to be aware of, that these things can be overstated. And the other thing I would add is, and this comes from the IPCC itself, is that these removals are thought of as temporary. They might be temporary over decades, but they are quite risky. So anything could happen. Ash dieback could come along and remove our woodlands as it is at the moment, or wildfire could sweep through and undo years of peatland restoration work. So we have to be careful about relying on natural solutions for those very reasons, which, you know, I suppose the message I'm trying to get is we can't just rely on removals. We have to do work to decarbonise. And then just to finish, some visualisations. This is the high peak and the Peak District of some of our peatland restoration work. And I think that the message here is creating carbon sequestration is one thing, but actually doing that comes with multiple benefits around nature, around access for people, around building climate resilient landscapes, so wetter landscapes that hold floodwater back, for example, provide water resources into the future. This is an image of the Dales where we're letting more woody, scrubby growth come back into the valleys to ensure that will sequester carbon, but it also keep water back in that landscape. And then lastly, this is just Wallington, a large estate up in Northumberland, where we've been doing a lot of work slowing the flow of the river, creating these wet, woody habitats, which are rich in nature, crisscrossed by more access routes, just really lovely places to be. We need our land to do that multiple benefits.